A starving bear knocked on his door. His decision changed everything. Consider this. You're by yourself at home, with only tall trees and miles of snow surrounding you. Your windows rattle as the wind screams through the thick woodland, serving as a continual reminder of how far away civilization is. No neighbors live close by, no guests, the solitude, and just you. It's the kind of silence that may occasionally make you feel uneasy and hyper-aware of every sound. Then, without warning, you hear something unexpected. There's a knock. Your heart is thumping. Who might it be? It is late at night. This place is never visited. No one even knows you're here, which is more significant than the fact that you weren't expecting anyone. Your mind is buzzing with potential as you gently walk to the door, a shiver running down your spine. Is the traveler lost, a hiker in trouble, or worse? You reach for the doorknob, your hands trembling a little. You pause. Something tells you not to open it. However, curiosity triumphs. As soon as you open the door, you freeze. Something enormous is standing in the faint light of your porch light, directly in front of you. A scary thing. A bear that is starving. Its thin, spotty fur is pressed up against its ribs. Its sunken eyes meet yours with an even more eerie look than one of aggression, desperation. And then you understand. It's more than just a bear. It's a dying animal, and it's calling for assistance at your door. How would you respond? Are you going to run, make a help call, or take a risk no one else would? When you first see something, your mind doesn't want to process it. This bear isn't the powerful, intimidating predator you've always thought of. No, the monster in front of you is only a shadow of its former self. Once thick and beautiful, its fur is now twisted, uneven, and covered in filth. Under the thin layer of skin that covered its body, each rib was apparent, protruding like the wooden beams of an old deserted home. As it stands, its legs tremble, unable to support its weight. Then, its eyes are seen. They're not crazy. They don't have the wrath of an animal poised to strike or the wrath of a ravenous beast. No, they're not real. Empty, life drained. However, there's something even more eerie in those deep, sunken eyes. An appeal. There's a reason this bear is here. There's a reason it exists. It is going hungry, feeble, in a desperate situation. For days, perhaps weeks, it has struggled against the harsh cold, starvation, and the harshness of nature. It has now done something unimaginable in a final effort to survive. It's come your way. A person. Something to be feared. Nevertheless, it has arrived at your door rather than fleeing or hiding in the shadows of the forest. Since it has no other option, it's requesting assistance. And the query still stands. Are you going to give it? Your throat tightens with every breath. Your gut is screaming for you to shut the door, to turn away. Must act as if something had never occurred. It's a bear, an animal in the wild. Normally, a predator would never approach a human this closely unless it was prepared to attack. However, this time is different. The bear does not snarl. It's not showing off its fangs. It isn't getting ready to attack. It simply stands there, shaking, awaiting. I'm hoping. Its hunger and fatigue are palpable. It doesn't have to talk. Its body speaks for itself. The end of the road is where it is. The decision is now yours. Before it falls on your porch, do you slam the door and hope it leaves? Do you call for assistance, even when you know no one will get there in time? Do you reach for a firearm as a precaution? Or do you do something totally out of the blue? Do you assist it? Do you extend kindness to a creature that has never experienced it? Overcoming fear, reason, and the natural order of things. For if you do, if you take that chance, It may potentially alter everything. For the bear, as well as for you. Your heart is pounding. You clench your fingers around the door frame. You know with all your heart that this is a life or death situation. One mistaken action, and anything could go wrong. The bear steps forward unsteadily. It doesn't charge, but you cringe out of instinct. It doesn't snarl. Rather, it ends a few inches from your porch. Its respiration is laborious and heavy. Every breath is a battle. Its enormous structure wobbles, struggling to stay upright. Then, in an instant that makes your spine tingle, the bear's head drops, not with hostility, not in anticipation of an assault. However, in surrender. I have nothing left to fight with, it seems to be saying. Your thoughts are racing. Will it fall apart in front of you if you do nothing? Will the chilling snow kill it? Or will it suddenly realize it's a predator if you make a mistake? You sense the deafening silence all around you. Tension permeates the air. The bear waits and observes you. And now, standing at the intersection of bravery and terror, you are aware that you have just seconds to make a choice. What are you going to do? Ethan was not a man who was afraid of the wilds. Tucked away in a tiny wooden cottage miles from the closest town, he had spent years living in the mountains. Although it wasn't an easy life, he liked it that way. It had never felt like home in the outer world, with its cities, commotion, and people. But the mountains, they provided him with something unavailable elsewhere. Calm. Ethan read old, tattered books by candlelight, chopped wood for the fireplace, and fished in the freezing river that ran behind his hut. The wind screaming through the trees and the occasional wolf's distant cry were his sole companions. He was accustomed to the quiet. He was used to being by himself. Above all, he had become accustomed to the unspoken rule of the wild: keep out of nature's way, and nature will stay out of yours. However, that regulation was about to be violated. He was enjoying a cup of hot coffee by the fire that night when he heard something that broke the stillness. There's a knock. Ethan scowled. He had no one in mind. So far, no one has come out. His thoughts were already racing when he set down his cup. A lost traveler, perhaps. A hunter. Perhaps a park ranger. But a profound uneasiness developed in his chest as he got to his feet and grabbed his flashlight, since no human would knock in that manner. It weighed too much, too sluggish, deliberate, almost. He walked to the door, paused for a second, then unlocked it, his heart thumping. He inhaled deeply. He pulled it open after that, and everything in his universe changed in that moment. In the mountains, Ethan's cottage stood by itself, encircled by thick blankets of unspoiled snow and infinite stretches of tall pine trees. This was a different world, quiet, still, the kind of silence that made you acutely aware of every sound, whether it was the delicate crunch of fresh snow beneath your feet, the whisper of the wind as it slithered through the woods, or the distant crack of a branch. There were no roads to this place. No distant streetlights were flickering. Hours away, down a narrow, hardly perceptible road that few knew existed, was the closest town. There was a reason Ethan had picked this location. It was a distraction-free life, without any disruptions. The only things left were him, his cabin, and the surrounding nature. Small but solid, the cabin had been hand-built long before Ethan had ever stepped inside. The heavy, old planks that built up the walls told tales of violent storms and hard winters. In the middle was the stone fireplace that created lengthy shadows on the floor as its warmth flickered across the wooden walls. A frozen river sliced through the valley behind the chalet, its surface glistening in the moonlight. It was brimming with fish in the summer. It was silent in winter, with ice so thick it could support a bear's weight. The air was colder than usual that night. 1,000 stars were scattered throughout the dark sky, glimmering like broken glass. After the wind had subsided, there was an unnaturally thick silence. Ethan, however, was unaware of all of that, because someone had just disturbed the silence by someone knocking on his door. There had always been a sense of peaceful seclusion in Ethan's cabin. There were no visitors out here, far from the closest town. Hikers have never gone this far into the forest. No travelers ended up at his door after getting lost. He was all by himself. That's why it didn't make sense when someone knocked on his door. He became motionless. He put down his coffee cup and strained to hear the quiet. Perhaps he made it up. Branches may scratch against the wood due to wind tricks. This wouldn't be the initial instance. However, after that, one more knock, this time louder, more slowly. Ethan's pulse accelerated. His initial impulse was to reach for the rifle that was hung above his fireplace. You had to be ready for anything out here. A stranger in need, a hazardous animal. What was behind that door was unknown to him. For a minute his hand lingered above the firearm. He shook his head after that. No, he didn't want to confront them with a gun if they were a lost traveler. Rather, his boots creaked on the wood floor as he reached for his flashlight and moved toward the door. Every stride exacerbated the tension in his chest, making his breath feel heavier. He hesitated when he finally got to the door. Something twisted in his gut, something deep and disturbing. Then he pushed it open while taking a steadying breath, and his blood ran cold when he saw what was on the other side. A bear was standing on his snow-covered porch. Not any bear, though. A bear that is starving. Unsteady on its feet, its enormous body wavered. Its once thick fur had become thin and greasy, exposing pointed ribs that protruded like a dying tree's framework. Ethan felt a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold, but more with the hollowness in its sunken eyes. His throat tightened with each breath. All his survival instincts begged him to close the door. It was a predator, something powerful enough to easily rip through his cabin. Its claws might instantly kill him with a single stroke. The bear did not, however, attack. It didn't snarl. Ethan didn't expect it to accomplish anything. It remained still, gazing. Its flanks rose and fell with slow, labored effort as it breathed heavily. Then in a split second that made Ethan shiver, the bear's head dropped, not with hostility, not preparing to attack, but in what appeared to be a near defeat. Ethan's knuckles were white as he held onto the door frame. He was familiar with bears. He had previously seen them, observing them from afar when they hunted or fished in the river, but never in this manner, never so defenseless. The bear was in danger of dying. Additionally, rather than hiding in the wilderness or choosing a spot to let nature do its thing, it had arrived at his house, as though it was aware, like it was requesting assistance. Ethan's thoughts were racing. Was this all in his head? Was the bear acting strangely because it was hungry, or was there another reason? There was no doubt that this bear had arrived for a purpose. Ethan had to decide at this very moment. It was the closest Ethan had ever seen a bear. Not in this manner, not in a human-feeling way. The bear ought to have been frightful. It ought to have been a natural force, an untamed and erratic beast that made him flee for his life. Ethan felt something very different, though, as he stood there motionless, holding against the doorframe for support. Don't be afraid, but sympathy. The bear's eyes were not wild. They were deep, profound pools of dark brown. They were devoid of anger, hostility, and the need to strike. They were vacant, weary, defeated. These weren't a predator's eyes. It was the expression of a dying beast. It hadn't given up, though. It had walked here, even though its ribs were pressing against its diminishing fur, and its huge bulk was heavy with fatigue. He had realized it. As he observed the bear's trembling legs, its heaving chest, rise and fall, and its tired eyes blink slowly, Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. He didn't feel threatened by it. It didn't move at all. It remained still, awaiting, pleading, and more than anything else, that was what made Ethan shiver. Bears are not beggars. They go hunting. They make it through. They harvest from the soil what they require. However, this bear, there was nothing left for it to accept. It was too weak to fight, and it had done something that no wild animal should ever do. Deep inside its dwindling instincts, he was the one it had trusted. Drying his throat, Ethan swallowed hard. All his rational faculties begged him to back off, shut the door, and leave. However, there was something in those eyes, something in the way they begged for assistance in silence, made it impossible. Ethan stood in the doorway, his heart racing and his breath coming in short gasps. All of his instincts told him to close the door. It was a bear, an animal in the wild, a predator. It was dangerous despite its weakness, despite its sunken eyes and shaking legs. He wouldn't have a chance if it decided to leap forward, swipe with its claws, and make a last-ditch effort to survive. He was aware of that. That was what his entire intellect told him. Still, though, he remained still. His hand was hovering close to the door, ready to shut it, lock himself inside, and act as though this had never occurred. He could drink his coffee, sit by the fire, and never remember those desperate eyes looking back at him. That would be the wise course of action, wouldn't it? Isn't that the prudent course of action? But he didn't, because his heart was telling him something different than what his instincts were urging him to do. He had learned the unwritten laws of nature while residing in these highlands for years. Predators hunted. The prey fled. The resilient made it through. The weak didn't. The wild operated like way. However, what if that rule could be broken just once? What if he was able to change it? His fingers curled around the door's edge as he gulped, forcefully. He had an option. He might take a back seat, shut the door, and let nature do its thing. Or the biggest risk of his life could be taken, and assist in bearing. Ethan had shaking hands, with every instinct telling him that this was a bad decision. His heart pounded against his ribs. However, he was unable to close that door because of something within of him that went beyond dread. Keeping his gaze fixed on the animal, he walked slowly back into the cabin. It made no sound and didn't move. It simply remained there, wobbling slightly from side to side, as though it was straining to maintain its balance. Ethan's thoughts were racing. He couldn't remain in this position indefinitely. He needed to take action. So, defying all reason, he reached over to the kitchen counter and took a loaf of bread. Not much. However, it was something. He tore off a few pieces, his hands shaky. After taking a big breath, he moved closer than he probably should have, and placed the food carefully onto the snow-covered ground. A few feet ahead of the bear, nothing happened for a second. As though it didn't comprehend what had just transpired, the bear stayed motionless, its body rigid. It was as though it had forgotten what eating was. Ethan took a swallow. Did it not desire it? Was it too feeble to consume? Had he misjudged the whole thing? However, after that, the bear shifted. It lowered its enormous head slowly, almost awkwardly, and sniffed the bread. Ethan held his breath. The bear then ate in a single frantic move. It ate the scraps, chewing rapidly and swallowing before it could taste them, as though it was afraid the food would run out before it could consume it all. Ethan let out a breath, even while his body was still tense. Something about the situation felt different. There had been no bear attack. It hadn't snarled. It hadn't tried to push its way inside or leaped at him. All it had done was accept his offer. Now, as it completed the final bite, it took an even more surprising action. It raised its head and gazed at him once more, awaiting, I'm hoping. At that moment, Ethan came to a realization. The bear wasn't merely going hungry. It had relied upon him, and that faith, more than anything, it terrified him. The bear raised its head once again and fixed Ethan with its dark, hollow eyes as soon as the last crumb vanished. Ethan's breathing became labored. It remained. The bear remained even after the food was gone. His head was full of questions as his fingers coiled around the doorframe. Why didn't it move away? A wild animal would undoubtedly grab any food it could find and vanish into the jungle, even if it were famished. Nature operated in this manner. Take what you require, proceed, make it through. However, this bear, it remained still. It didn't growl. It wasn't showing off its fangs. There were no indications of aggressiveness from it. All it was waiting. Ethan gulped hard as his instincts and reason clashed. This wasn't typical. Things weren't meant to proceed that way. Nevertheless, here they were, ensnared in a silent comprehension. The bear required more than simple sustenance. More was required. It required assistance. He'd been selected by it. Ethan's heart was thumping in his chest. Would he be able to ignore this thing now? Because he knew in his heart this was just the start. Ethan didn't get much sleep that night. His thoughts were racing. All his senses informed him that his actions were hazardous. Feeding a bear in the wild? It violated every survival guideline he had ever been taught. What if it returned with more expectations? What if it started to rely on him? What if it was desperate one night instead of just hungry? However, in the morning, Ethan was in charge of cooking. Not for himself, for the bear. He had no idea why. It might have been guilt, curiosity, perhaps. Or perhaps just possibly he couldn't get rid of the way it had gazed at him. The silent appeal. The way it waited without attacking or growling. So that evening, Ethan stood at the door with food in hand as the sky became rich orange and purple. He opened it with a racing heart, wondering if the bear had gone. However, it was present, waiting while sitting in the snow. The door hadn't been scratched. It hadn't made an effort to go inside. It has just come back, as quiet as ever. With a sigh, Ethan stepped out onto the porch. He threw out a few scraps, more than the previous time, but cautiously. After sniffing the air, the bear limped on, continuing to eat as frantically as before. Still not sure what he was doing, Ethan observed with taut muscles. Was something wrong with him? However, the bear repeated the same thing it had done the previous evening after eating its food. It stayed. It did nothing but sit, awaiting, not threatening, not pleading, simply being there. Ethan suddenly came to the odd realization that he was no longer terrified. This turned into their unwritten habit. The bear returned each night. Ethan also put food outside each night. He never made an effort to approach. He did not attempt to touch it. He appreciated their distance from one another. Nevertheless, their understanding grew greater in silence, night after night. The bear was recovering. and in a manner that Ethan was unable to describe, he was, too. Ethan was unable to deny the reality as the days went by. This couldn't go on indefinitely. Like clockwork, the bear would show up each night to wait for the food that Ethan had left outside while sitting in the snow. Every night, Ethan observed it eating, growing stronger, its ribs becoming less noticeable, and its once thin fur thickening. But he felt in his heart that this was wrong. In the wild, things weren't like this. Bears were not meant to be dependent on people. They were designed to hunt, forage, and live independently, not wait for scraps by a cabin door, and it got riskier the longer this went on. What if the bear becomes overly used to people? What if it happened to stroll into town one day, hoping to be greeted with friendliness, and instead encountered fear? A famished creature in need would not be perceived by people. They would perceive danger. Threats were also not given second chances. Or worse, what if hunger seized over one evening? What if the bear, now more powerful, forgot the silent agreement they had made? What if intuition prevailed over faith? Ethan's fists are clenched. He had to consider the worst-case scenario, even if he didn't want to. This wasn't a pet. It wasn't a companion. The animal was untamed, and it had to revert to its original behavior. Through the open doorway, Ethan gazed at the bear, which completed its meal and waited as usual. His shoulders were heavy when he breathed. The time had come. He had to decide: continue to feed it, and eventually endanger its life, or teach it to live alone. He developed a lump in his throat. He was well aware of his obligation. However, that didn't make things any simpler. It never occurred to Ethan that he might grow accustomed to waiting for a bear. However, he was standing at the door of his hut, listening for the sound of snow crunching beneath heavy paws. Additionally, like every other night, arrived. Like a silent ghost, the bear's enormous shape moved through the darkness as it emerged from the trees. Once spotty and tattered, its fur has begun to regrow. Its feeble, shaky steps had become firmer. However, one thing remained constant. It always came to a stop at the same location, a short distance from his porch, awaiting. Ethan let out a sigh, went outside, and tossed leftovers to the ground, just like he always did. As though this were the only world it had ever known, the bear sniffed the air before lowering its head and eating. Ethan wasn't impressed with the routine, though. The trust was the reason. The bear had lost its fear. It didn't recoil. It did not pause. It did not perceive him as a threat or prey. Ethan, for some reason, also didn't perceive it as a danger. This unsaid link between a man and a wild beast should have been terrible. However, instead of it being instinctive. Nevertheless, Ethan saw the bear gaze at him through the gloomy light as it finished its food and raised its head. He was aware this cannot continue indefinitely. One of them would soon have to leave. Ethan had first remained wary, keeping a safe distance and never lowering his defenses. However, something changed as the evenings went by. His terror subsided. He ought to have been afraid. Every time the bear reappeared, he should have been nervous, since he knew that one mistake could ruin this quiet conversation. However, he didn't. Rather, he began to feel something very different. A link. Feeding an animal that was going hungry was no longer the only concern. Something more profound. Something unsaid. They had developed a bond. The bear approached without hesitation. When Ethan went outside, it stopped flinching. It no longer behaved like a ferocious animal terrified of people. What about Ethan? It was more than simply a bear to him now. It was a survivor in his eyes. A combatant is a being that had been close to passing away, but persisted. They seemed to understand each other every night when their eyes locked. They had both opted for isolation. They had both adapted to living alone. Nevertheless, here they were, two creatures, planets apart, brought together by an inexplicable bond. For years, Ethan had distanced himself from the outside world, thinking he was self-sufficient. However, this bear, it was showing him to be mistaken. Ethan thought Bear would change. It was sickly, malnourished, and barely hanging on when it initially arrived at his door. However, as it recovered its vigor night after night, Ethan had feared, thought, that its instincts would come back. He would go outdoors one evening and see a predator instead of a creature in need. However, that time never arrived. There was no attack by the bear. It didn't snarl. It simply waited. There it was, sitting in the snow, placid, still, patient. Every night when Ethan opened the door, it wasn't difficult. It wasn't agitated. It wasn't hunting for its next meal like a ravenous animal. It just observed him. The bear appeared to have learned the routine and anticipated Ethan's arrival. Ethan found himself staying up a little later each night, not because he was studying the bear, but because the silence between them felt different now, not tense, not dangerous. It was familiar. And that realization sent a chill through Ethan, because for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. And in some weird, nearly impossible way, it felt like trust. This bear wasn't merely searching for food, and it struck Ethan like an unexpected cold wind. It was trying to find him, not as prey, not as a danger, but as a final resort. He experienced an odd, unpleasant feeling upon realizing this. Bears were independent of people. They didn't wait patiently, knock on doors, or come back night after night hoping for goodwill. However, this one did. Ethan could see it in its eyes, an unspoken plea, a silent agreement. It had been its only defense against the harsh winter. It was getting weaker every day after wandering for miles. Like so many other animals who failed to survive the winter, it ought to have perished out there, lost in the snow. However, it didn't, because it had somehow found him, and it had trusted him somehow. Ethan let out a breath and observed the bear settling into the snow, while continuing to wait and observe. It refused to go, because it knew in its heart that it wouldn't make it. Ethan's fingers curled into fists as he tightened his jaw. This was not what he had requested, but this bear had put its life in his hands, whether he liked it or not, and now he needed to decide it. Ethan watched the bear finish its food while leaning against the doorframe. It had been the same pattern every night. The bear showed up. He gave it food. It waited, never demanding, never hostile, just trusting. However, something felt different tonight. Ethan wiped his face and let out a breath. It couldn't continue. Now the bear was more powerful. Its fur was getting thicker, and the distinct contour of its ribs was disappearing. The weak, dying thing that had originally shown up at his door, wasn't it? It was restorative, and there was only one meaning for that. It was time to leave. The thought made Ethan's stomach turn. He had been caring for this bear for weeks, seeing it change from a malnourished, near-death animal to a strong, resilient being once more. However, what followed? What if it didn't go? What if it became too used to humans? Too dependent? What if it happened to wander into town one day, expecting kindness, and instead encountered fear? People wouldn't notice the relationship that Ethan had formed. They wouldn't comprehend that this bear wasn't seeking trouble or posing a threat. They would perceive danger. Threats were also not given second chances. Ethan clenched his teeth. This was something he needed to stop before it was too late. The bear had to figure out how to live by itself. The sole query was, would it even recall how? Ethan was aware that stopping meals would not be sufficient. The bear needed to regain its wildness if it was to live. Consequently, they needed to acquire hunting skills. Ethan did something different the following evening than his usual practice of leaving food on the porch. He stepped outside, empty-handed. The bear sat in the snow and cocked its head, awaiting, anticipating. This time, however, Ethan did not throw out scraps. Rather, he turned and moved on. The bear's ears perked up, its body shifting as if confused. Ethan took a few more steps toward the dense tree line, then stopped. He glanced back. Would it follow? For a time, it paused. Then it got up, cautiously, and started to lumber after him. Ethan guided it along the slender path behind his cabin, past the frozen ground, through the dense trees, and to the location he knew it must go, the river. By the time they arrived at the edge of the freezing water, the bear was standing next to him, watching the stream flow. Fish continued to swim beneath the thin coating of ice, darting between the shadows cast by the rocks below, indicating that the river was not entirely frozen. Ethan stooped to pick up a stick nearby and tossed it into the river. The splash made the bear wince, still not sure what this meant. Its eyes darted from the undulating surface to Ethan. Observing him, waiting. Pointing at the water, Ethan said. He whispered, "Go on," fully certain that the bear would not comprehend. However, it might, just might, understand what he was doing. He demonstrated the movement by tossing another rock into the shallows, simulating how fish break the surface. The bear did not move as it observed. Ethan let out a sigh. Time was going to be needed for this. After relying on him for so many nights and starving for so long, the bear had lost the ability to survive on its own. Ethan, however, was not giving up, because if he could remind it of its purpose and teach it to hunt anew, then perhaps, just possibly, it wouldn't require him. The initial days were annoying. The bear would simply stand there and stare at Ethan as he led it to the river, pointed to the water, and even stirred the surface with a stick. It did not advance. It did not respond. It merely observed him. It appeared as though weeks of famine had wiped off its instincts for hunting, leaving it unable to remember what to do. The bear refused to move, and Ethan wasn't sure if it was due to fear, weakness, or just plain uncertainty. As usual, it waited for him to feed it. Ethan, nevertheless, refused to give in. He returned it to the river every day. He allowed me to watch the fish swimming below the surface every day. To see the flowing river below, he trampled the ice, breaking thin layers, and every day he left without giving it any food. The bear needed to figure this out if it wanted to eat. Then something changed on the 6th day. Ethan watched the bear pace along the river's edge from where he usually stood. As it finally saw the fish moving beneath the surface, it sniffed the air and twitched its ears. It took a slow step forward, then another. Ethan held his breath, and then, in a swift, explosive motion, the bear swept its big paw into the water, a splatter, a haze of motion. Then a fish, in a single, powerful blow, the bear lifted it from the river, flipping, flailing, and glistening in the sunlight. For the first time, the bear wasn't waiting. It wasn't reliant on him. It had recalled. Ethan felt something quiver in his chest. Relief. The bear was still capable of surviving. All it needed was a reminder. There was no denying the change. A weak, famished animal that had before knocked on Ethan's door was no longer there. The bear was different. Under its drab fur, its ribs, which had formerly been sharp and prominent, were now hardly perceptible. Once more its coat was full, lustrous and thick. A serene assurance had taken the place of the lifeless, hollow expression in its eyes. It no longer waited each night at his door. He no longer had to give it scraps. Rather, it had made its way back to the river, hunting, eating, surviving. Ethan leaned against a nearby tree and observed the bear moving through the shallows with ease, its strong paws creating ripples in the water. It quickly snatched another fish out of the river and threw its head back to eat it completely. This was the way it was meant to be. However, Ethan felt an odd weight descend in his chest. This bear has been a part of his life for weeks, a quiet presence, a pattern, a reassurance that I was not as isolated as he had always thought. Now, however, he knew as he saw it flourish once more in the wild. It was almost time to bid them farewell. Not all of it would occur at once. The bear would return to the river one day. Ethan would also be absent. It would eventually vanish into the trees, and it refused to come back. And Ethan would have to let it go when the time came, 'cause this was never supposed to be permanent, and deep down, he had always known that. Ethan stepped onto his porch, just like he had every evening for the past several weeks. But tonight, something was different. The air was quiet, the moon throwing a lovely shine over the snow-covered ground. Trees stood unmoving, their black outlines melding into the night. The regular sounds of the forest, the distant growls of wolves, the rustling of branches in the wind, felt curiously missing. What about the bear? It had vanished. For the first time in weeks, it didn't come. Ethan waited. He stood outside longer than usual, his breath making delicate clouds in the cool night air. In the quest of any activity, his gaze swept across the tree line. Not a thing. Perhaps it's getting late, he told himself. Perhaps it was merely distracted, pursuing something through the forest and putting its power to the test, in ways it had never done before. He knew the truth, though, in his heart. It would not return. It had finally come, the moment he had dreaded and been prepared for. The bear was no longer in need of him. Ethan tightened his jaw and gulped down the lump that was growing in his throat. He must have been relieved. Instead, nonetheless, he was surprised by the emptiness he felt. He had thought for so long that he was destined to live alone. The solitude was something he had favored and chosen, but he had never felt more alone in his life than he did now, standing in the silence on his doorstep. He let out a long sigh, looked back at the trees, and went back inside. He did not lock the door, just in case. It was only one night, Ethan reminded himself. The bear might have gone farther than normal. Perhaps it had discovered more suitable hunting areas. It might return. However, the reality became indisputable as the days passed. The bear had vanished. Every night, Ethan would climb onto the porch and look around the forest's edge, anticipating the recognizable appearance of that enormous figure rising from the trees. But each night, he was met with nothing but silence. There were no thick paw impressions indicating the route it had previously followed, and the new snowfall was unaltered. He left food leftovers out occasionally, just in case, but they never came in contact with anything once so familiar. The pattern was now disrupted. Ethan made an effort to concentrate on his regular activities, such as fishing, woodworking, and cabin repairs, but something wasn't quite right. His thoughts kept returning to the bear, to their silent understanding, to the connection they had developed. Had it truly left for good? Had it moved deeper into the mountains, returning to the wild where it belonged? Or worse, had something happened? Ethan shoved the thought away. He had witnessed its strength increase. He had witnessed it relearning how to hunt. It has already made it through once. It was now leading the life it was destined to lead. That ought to have been sufficient. Ethan, however, was unable to ignore the pain in his chest as he stood at the door and gazed into the deserted forest for the first time in a long time, since something slipped his mind, or perhaps someone. It never occurred to Ethan that bidding farewell to a wild animal would be painful. However, as the days went by and the quiet became longer, he came to the disturbing realization that he missed the bear. The steady crunch of snow beneath heavy paws was something he missed. He missed going outside to see it standing there, not demanding, not hostile, just it felt emptier on the porch now. It was quieter at night. All of a sudden, the routine he had never intended to have was gone. It was odd. He had chosen to live alone for years, thinking that this was the natural state of things. Nevertheless, he had been accustomed to something different without even recognizing it. It wasn't quite distance, but it wasn't quite friendship either. Something halfway, and it was gone now. However, despite the pain and odd empty sensation in his chest, he felt a sense of pride. The bear was still alive. It had recovered from the brink of death, regained its ability to hunt, and become strong enough to go back to being wild. He was no longer necessary for it. Wasn't that the point? Ethan let out a breath and wiped his face while gazing at the snow-capped trees outside. It had been an unplanned journey, one he had neither requested nor anticipated. However, perhaps, just possibly both of them had been altered by it. This was the moment Ethan had always known would arrive. He knew this was only temporary, since the first night the starving bear had shown up at his door. It was never intended to last. He never had it to keep. Even still, it wasn't any simpler knowing that. He was standing on the porch, looking out at the deserted forest, where the bear had been waiting for him. However, it was no longer waiting, since it didn't require him. Not right now. Never again. It should have been a reassuring thought. Knowing that he had done the right thing should have given him peace. It had been strengthened, healed, and reminded of what it meant to be wild. Thanks to him. It had previously endured without him, and it was doing it once again now. However, that didn't alter the fact that he had become accustomed to it. The calm friendship, the way it had just been there with him, all that was gone now. Ethan inhaled slowly, allowing his lungs to fill with the chilly mountain air. Then he let it go for the first time, because it was always intended to accomplish that. Ethan's throat tightened with each breath. He briefly believed that his mind was deceiving him. However, it was real. The bear was standing at the edge of the forest, somewhat obscured by the trees' shadows. Larger, more powerful. The weak, malnourished thing that had rapped on his door was gone. Its enormous frame was strong and stable, and its fur was thick and shining in the golden sunlight. It no longer appeared weak. Instead, it appeared lost. It appeared crazy, living free. Nevertheless, it was present. With his heart pounding in his ears, Ethan relaxed his hold on the axe. He remained still, didn't say anything. Neither did the bear. They simply remained there, frozen in a silence that neither of them could quite comprehend. Ethan had questioned whether he would ever see it again after his last encounter. It was there now, in front of him. For what reason? What had caused it to return? Ethan took a deep breath and released it gradually. He was aware of the need for caution. Somehow, though, he didn't feel scared. The answer he already knew somehow. Staring at the bear, Ethan stood motionless, holding the axe loosely in his hands. As silently as it had arrived, he expected it to move, to turn and leave, to vanish into the jungle, but it didn't. Rather, the bear took an action that he could never have predicted. The thing gave a nod, a deliberate, slow motion. It was a planned movement, not a random head tilt or thoughtless motion. A genuine thing. Ethan's throat tightened with each breath. He had spent years observing animals, understanding their instincts and their behaviors. However, this was not like the others. There was no hunger here. This was not a case of survival. This was acknowledgement. They shared a moment that was burdened with meaning and an unsaid element. The bear's dark eyes met his, but this time they were filled with something other than desperation, gratitude. It wasn't just looking at him, it was thanking him. Ethan's fingers curled into his palms as his chest constricted. Had the bear simply admitted his mistake? He wanted to say something, to break the silence, to make sense of this unfathomable moment. But before he could, the bear pivoted, and it vanished into the trees without making any sound. Long after it had passed, Ethan stood there with the weight of that nod weighing heavily on him while the wind rustled quietly through the leaves. He had contributed to the bear's survival, and it had understood somehow, and with that last motion, it had bid farewell. Ethan remained still. His breath seized in his chest as he stood there, still understanding what had just happened, staring at the location where the bear had been. The bear, his bear, had come back for a different reason, not because he was hungry or desperate, for the sake of closure, for a quiet recognition of everything that they had endured, and now it was on its way out. The bear's enormous body blended into the tree shadows, as Ethan watched it return to the forest with slow, steady steps. There was no hesitation. It wasn't looking back. It merely pushed onward, back to where it belonged. After being completely engulfed by the dense undergrowth, it vanished in a matter of seconds. Ethan needed to pursue it, to catch a final look, and confirm that this was not a pipe dream. But he knew deep down, the end came with this. A peculiar mixture of emotions, including pride, relief, and grief, settled inside him as he inhaled. And something else, a warmer one, for this was more than a farewell. It was evidence of the life-changing power of compassion, evidence that even the most untamed animals were capable of recognizing kindness, proof that sometimes you don't know you need something, but life provides it when you least expect it. The bear vanished without a trace. Ethan, however, would never forget it. Ethan remained there for a while, gazing into the deserted forest where the bear had disappeared. This time, the vast, unending silence that surrounded him didn't make him feel lonely, because he knew something now, something he hadn't grasped before. Being kind is risky. He had taken a chance that night, opening his door to something wild, something deadly. Even if his gut told him to turn away, he had decided to assist. And in exchange, he had seen something unusual, something that would be hard for most people to believe. A link, a connection, a comprehension that transcended words, instincts, and fear. Because occasionally, that generosity, it transforms everything. For the bear, for Ethan, for the entire world, and perhaps, just possibly, for you. Tell me, would you answer your door if a famished bear knocked? Ethan made up his mind. He had the option to walk away, close the door, and let nature do its thing. He opted for kindness instead. He decided to take a chance, to face his fear, and to have faith that even the most untamed animals are capable of showing compassion. And that decision ultimately altered everything. Now let me ask you, would you answer your door if a hungry bear knocked? Would you risk it? Which would you pick, fear, or would you go for kindness? Tell me in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please remember to subscribe and like the video for more inspiring tales like this one, because often the greatest transformations come from the tiniest deeds of compassion. If you are moved by this tale, please subscribe and use the like button for more motivational stories like this one. These kinds of tales serve as a reminder that kindness can transform lives even in the most unlikely circumstances. I want to hear from you now, though. If you were Ethan, How would you have responded? Would you have accepted the danger? Did you intend to open the door? Would you have left instead? I read them all, so please share your thoughts in the comments section below. And keep in mind, sometimes our decisions determine who we are, not only for ourselves, but also for other people. I appreciate you watching, and I hope to see you in the future tale.